everyone, and welcome back to our third Thursday Buddy Read live chat with Corin Faye. Corin, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Well, yeah, thank you for having me, Trisha. It's delightful.
Of course. So my name is Patricia Meredith, and if you're not familiar with my work, I am a historical mystery author. I have written the Spokane Clock Tower Mysteries, which are up here. Butcher Baker Candlestick Taker is the first one, and then there's two others, and then I'm working on books 4 through 6 right now, as well as a new project, but we'll get into that later because Corin is also going to talk about his project that he's been working on. So if you're here, be sure to say hi in the live chat and leave any questions for us that you might have, any comments that have to do with what we're discussing. We are very, very excited to talk about And Then There Were None. So if you've been following my channel, you know that originally we were going to discuss Dracula, and we hit a little bit of a hiccup, and it's totally my fault. I thought that I could handle reading a vampire novel, and I cannot. So even though it was set in 19th century, and so I thought, okay, it's a little bit earlier, and I expected it to be a little bit just not as dark as it's honestly, it's not as dark. Most people will be able to handle it. Corin and I had a great discussion about horror and about what that level is and how it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
And for example, Corin, you had some thoughts of Dracula versus And Then There Were None, because you did go ahead and finish it.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
So I actually had an easier time reading Dracula And Then There Were None. And I actually didn't expect that. I thought Dracula was going to be a tough read. Vampires were the things that scared me the most as a kid. And I remember reading a kid's version of Dracula, and it scared me so much. And so I thought, this is going to be like my little litmus test to see if I can do this. And then I was surprised at how not scary it was. And I think it's because in Dracula, good and evil are very, like, you understand exactly what they are. There's no ambiguity. The good characters are very good, and the evil characters are very evil. And that was very unusual for nowadays. Like, I feel like now it's much more about the ambiguity, and you don't have as much of just the very much good and evil. What fascinated me about Dracula, first of all, let me say, it's very Christian. I'm not sure if the author was a Christian or if it's just that it was the 19th century. And so there's just that whole Christian backdrop. And of course, vampires they're afraid of the crucifix, and they're afraid of communion wafers, and they're afraid of there's something with holy ground. And basically the gospel is preached. It's very, oh yeah, it's like the gospel is preached in Dracula. I was kind of shocked.
Yeah.
So, and what's interesting to me is that the vampires have basically they themselves have been preyed on by evil. And the author doesn't really explain in detail, but he just says that sort of the airs of Transylvania, kind of like there's just some kind of darkness there, and people were able to kind of delve into, but it preys even on the vampires. And so, like, there's a sense in which even the vampires are like relieved to be to lose their vampireness when they're finally killed.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting, and the characters that are preyed upon, like there's a character called Lucy Westenra, and she's one of the victims, and she's just a totally innocent person. And so one of the things that it kind of highlighted to me, which is actually very, in a way, a much needed reminder, is that we're not like guilty in a way of the evil in the world. Kind of like we are in some senses, but in other ways, like, evil is just there and it just preys on people. And innocent people can be preyed upon by evil. And it even makes me think of like just violent crime, and that's where it kind of segues into like Agatha Christie, because even though vampires aren't necessarily like your standard criminals, it still is like they have their prey. You know, they have their people that they pick to visit their evil on. And so there is kind of this sense, especially with the character of Lucy, it's like she's not to blame for the fact that she's a victim, and she is so deeply affected by what happens to her that she herself kind of like experiences some kind of corruption there. Yeah, like she didn't really, she didn't really invite the vampires, and none of the characters invited the vampires to do what they did to them, that they were just the victim. So
Right. Whereas in And Then There Were None, it's all about ambiguity.
it's all,
And
yeah.
yeah, and it's all about who are they really guilty? Are they not guilty? What is the definition of guilt? What is the definition of justice?
Yeah.
You really only have one Christian character,
Yeah.
Emily Brent, who says anything, and she's the one who's quote in the book, at least she's constantly saying, well, there's a higher justice, and I'll find out whether I'm guilty or not, basically, when I get to heaven.
Well,
But then you have other characters who are answering her with,
yeah.
I don't believe in that. It's going to happen now, right? Your justice is going to be meted on you now, especially from the judge character, which it's obvious that he would have that mentality because he's a judge. So he would believe that he does hold in his hands the ability to find somebody guilty or not guilty. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Which kind of goes into the whole when Corin and I first read this, we both sat down, we read it in a day, if not less. I mean, it's like a couple hour read. It's really, really fast. And part of it is because it is all dialogue. It's like almost all dialogue. There's very little description. You get brief descriptions at the beginning of the characters, but they're really very bland, just kind of, and they all fit a stereotype. They are all very much a token person representing different things, and I want to get into that more because Corin had a lot of great thoughts on that. But what I kind of wanted to start with was just the fact that this is a very plot-driven novel. So
Yeah.
when we first sat down, we were like, "Oh, this is enjoyable. It's fun. It's quick. It's easy." But will there be anything for us to really discuss? But first, we were talking back and forth on Marco and going, I don't know, what can we talk about? Well, then we got in these really deep discussions
Yeah.
about what is justice and what is guilt and what makes us human, and just lots of really interesting things. So, which is probably because we're English majors, so we know how to turn anything into a good discussion. So yeah, so in order for us to really dive in, I think the best thing is for us to say this will not be a spoiler-free discussion. So we're just going to put that up now. This is not a spoiler-free discussion. So if you have not read And Then There Were None, I highly recommend that you come back to this video later after you have read it. Because it is really hard to talk about the entire book without giving away the ending, at least parts of it.
Mhm.
And especially, when we start talking about the characters and all sorts of things. So I think it's best to just say up front, this is not going to be spoiler free. So if you are a mystery lover and you really want to not know who the guilty party is, and you want to read it fresh, I highly recommend that you do so, because it is an excellent, excellent book. This is one of those books that I would love to be able to read again with fresh eyes, right? I wish I could forget the ending to this one and just read it straight through. Because I remember the first time I read it, my mom gave it to me, and she was like, "You're gonna love this. This is amazing." In fact, I think this is the first Agatha Christie I ever read, was this one. And I loved it, and I was totally thrown. I remember being very surprised by who the murderer was at the end. And I didn't see all the red herrings, and I didn't see all the things. But yeah, so I highly recommend reading this. It is one of the top 30 mysteries that you should ever read in your life. This is on the list from most people. So it is excellent, and eventually I'm sure we'll get a Kenneth Branagh version of it, and we'll talk about adaptations here in a minute. But
Yes.
yes, but well, actually, we can kind of go into that now, because right up front, like if you haven't read this and you're like, okay, instead I just want to watch a version of it, which is fine. But be careful because Corin and I were just talking about how they are very different versions. Each version is very different from the book. So depending on your level of, like we were saying, horror, what you can handle about graphic stuff, then there's certain versions that I would say steer away from. Corin, do you have a favorite version before we get into the ones we don't like?
See, I've only seen two, which are both the ones that we're going to criticize.
Right. Okay. Let's start further back. So we have, I think it's 1946. Is that what you said?
I believe it's 46. Yeah.
46. There's a black and white version, and it seems like most people that's what they have seen, or somehow that version was like available, or maybe they showed it on TCM a lot or something, growing up.
Yeah.
And so, or on what was that channel that was always like these old TV shows with all the classics, TV. Oh, what was it called?
Yeah,
Anyway,
that was it, wasn't it? TPN, or it was the Turner.
the Turner Classic Movies, right? TCM. Yeah, yeah. And so old black and white films, right? You get to see Casablanca for the first time, things like that, right?
Yeah.
Excellent movies. The originals of so many things that have been redone. So if you go out and look for it, you can probably find the 46 version. It's probably on Prime or somewhere.
Yeah.
AMC was another one. Yes, exactly. Thank you. So the 46 one changes the ending. That's my biggest memory of it, is that it's pretty
Yeah.
close, but yeah.
I would say that's the closest to the book until the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's why most people have seen that version, or at least that's the one that's most recommended, is they're like, well, it's like the book except for the ending, so just, watch it through to the ending, and then So since this is not spoiler free, okay guys, here we go.
Yeah.
All right. So at the end, there are two characters who at the end there are none, right? That's the point of the book. And then there were none. Except in 46, they couldn't have the two lovers get killed off at the end. So instead, they fake their deaths, come back in order to hear the final confession from the actual murderer. And instead of having him send a note in a bottle, which is how he does it in this version, is in this one, it is an unsolved mystery. They've never been able to solve it. And eventually they find this confession because, of course, the murderer has to tell how brilliant he's been in doing this.
Yes.
But then we watched another one. And what was the other one?
Oh, there's a 2015, I think it's Masterpiece Theater.
Yes.
One with like Aidan Turner in it,
Yes.
and a bunch of famous British actors are in that one.
Right. And that's the 3-parter, right?
3 parts, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that one I know I watched like through the library. So Aidan Turner is Keely or Feely, I can't ever remember which one, in The Hobbit. And he's Poldark. So to me, he's always Poldark every time I see him. But he plays the Philip Lombard. What's his name? Yeah.
Lombard, yep.
And who's the adventurer.
Yeah.
And he's the one with the most screen time, let's say. So you get to see him a lot and hear a lot from his story. It was good in its own way, but what were some thoughts that you had, Corin? Some reactions to it?
So the reason why the newer one bothers me is because it makes the characters actual, like they actually cold-bloodedly commit the crimes that they. Right. In the book, their crimes are a little bit more ambiguous. Not that they're not guilty, but it's just they make it a lot more. They make the characters a lot more horrible. I think in this new one. Yeah, which helps in the sense because you don't get attached to them.
True.
You don't, because but they're also it does lessen it makes it a little bit more black and white. I think, whether this is justice or not.
Right.
Whereas when I was reading the book, I was kind of like, some of these people probably should have been brought to justice, but others, I don't know if they could, if.
Right, exactly. Like Emily Brent is one.
Yeah.
You're kind of like, I don't know. And we'll get to that a little bit later. I definitely want to talk about each of the characters. She's definitely one where you're like, I don't know if I consider her guilty.
Yeah.
Same with the judge, he sentenced somebody. So is he really guilty? And then that kind of, that gives away the ending. But whereas the rest of them, it's the whole book is about getting into their heads and then wondering if they are guilty.
Yeah.
Right. And kind of dealing with their guilt and how that weighs on them.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's kind of the whole point with the murderer, right? Is he picked which ones the guilt was going to weigh so hard on that it would cause them to do things later on to others and to themselves. So in response to one of the questions was, I haven't seen any adaptations that have the same ending as the book. The Aidan Turner one does end like the book, as far as I remember, right? It's more that the characters in between are different.
Well, they do change it in the sense that the judge does not put the message in the bottle. That's not how they figure out. He says everything to like
to Vera, right?
to
Yeah.
the end. Yes,
Yes. Yeah.
it is a bit changed, but it's closer to the ending than the 46.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Where they go off into the sunset. So yeah. And in fact, in that one, it almost makes it like they're not guilty, is my memory. Is even in the 46 one, it's kind of like
they soften the crimes of the lovers
right.
to make them more sympathetic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So it's interesting that you didn't like the black and whiteness of the Aidan Turner adaptation, and yet one of the things you had for Dracula versus And Then There Were None was the fact that Dracula was black and white. And yeah,
well, and the thing is, if the book had been written that way, I think I
yeah,
wouldn't. It was more just that I thought the book had more substance to it,
yeah,
like than the film. So yeah, Dracula was written black and white. So that's why it didn't necessarily bother me that
right,
yeah.
yeah,
But
yeah, um, yeah. Uh, there's just yeah, because I mean, like we said, like there's so much to unpack in the book because it leaves so much to be discussed.
yeah,
Whereas the movies make it more, it's about, okay, we're gonna kill everybody off according to the poem. It's almost like it's more about what the murderer is doing,
yeah,
and how he does it, which is, I mean, I
yeah,
love it. I think it's really cool.
yeah,
Like, I mean, if,
yeah,
if I was designing a murder to follow a poem, which, is obviously somewhere in my mind because of the books that I like to write. I mean, I've talked about how like one of my favorite Miss Marples is Pocket Full of Rye, which is where the murderer is killing everybody off according to the poem,
yeah,
born 20 blackbirds baked in a pie and all of that.
right,
And then he gets stuck in following the poem. And so he ends up doing some things just to meet the poem. And in this one, I love the poem. And I've always wondered, like, did she make up the poem? Or is it really an old rhyme?
oh, I don't know, I never researched that.
I
I
didn't look
s
it up.
I just assumed that it was an act she always uses actual nursery rhymes and
Right.
poems and stuff,
I
so I just figured it
I
was
think she did because I think because of the original title of the book, right? Which we can't say. But because of the original title, I think it is based on an actual poem. Which just it's kind of cool that she came across this poem and thought, I mean, it's like if you wrote a book based on Who Killed Cock Robin,
yeah,
right? And you had like each of the characters, each of the birds come in and representing people or something like that, which I've got a story that's kind of like that. But it's yeah. So I mean, there's something cool about that. Um in it, in a, not that murder is cool. But if you're gonna write murder mysteries, that's I don't know, it's pretty cool how she found a poem and then is able to come up with a way for him to do it so that it meets every single one of them, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's kind of it gives you chills. It's
yeah.
like, wow, okay. It's
Well,
very manipulative and
it's a very beautiful piece of clockwork, isn't it?
it is. It
That
is.
just unwinds and you're just in awe of how the writer was so inventive.
Yeah, yeah.
So my version of the book had an introduction by Agatha Christie when she talked about how satisfying it was to write because
Oh,
of how she said it took so much planning.
yes.
She said it's so implausible and yet it's so satisfying because of just how intricate it is. And
Right.
I think the critics loved it. It sounds like they loved it because it was so well put together.
Right. Well, and it was one of a kind. I mean, who has
Yeah,
ever read a book where they're all dead by the end? So who did
yeah,
it? Right?
yeah,
They're all locked on an island. One
yeah,
of them killed. I mean, it's in my notes I had written down that it reminded me of the game Clue, right? It's obviously where the designer of Clue got the idea. Is well, I mean, like all murder house mysteries, right? But Clue specifically is like that, right? Even if you watch the comedy version, right, with Tim Curry and all of them, it's six people locked in a house and people keep dying around them. They're all guilty of something, so they all have a reason to have killed everybody there.
mhm,
So who did it, right?
yeah,
And which is the basis of And Then There Were None.
yeah,
Um, so yeah,
yep,
yeah,
yep. No, I love Clue and I love the restricted, oh, it's almost theatrical how everybody's in a just it's like the house is a stage, the island is a
Right.
stage. It's very theatrical in the sense of you have to be she's so good at being resourceful with this limited imaginative world she's created
Hmm.
where the characters they can hardly go anywhere. I mean, they're just literally stuck in this house on this rock in the middle of the ocean, and yet it's a whole kind of world unto itself. And it does become so frightening as you're reading because there isn't really anywhere for anyone to hide. She
Yeah.
makes that very clear. The house is modern. I always noted that from the time that I first read the book a long time ago. I was like, the house is a modern house. Most book covers have it as like an older house. Like my book
Mhm.
cover has it as like almost like a Victorian house because it looks more like a traditional haunted house, but it's modern and there's no
Yeah.
things are streamlined. There's no place for someone to hide.
Yeah.
It's and the island is a rock with no one can hide there, and so they
Right.
keep thinking, well, the evil or the bad person must be somewhere in a nook or cranny or in a shadow. It
Right.
can't be out in the open like one of us. But that's exactly what it ends up being. And the thing that they have to fear is in themselves, not in the actual spookiness of the surroundings or um, just an island where there could be a whole number of things hiding in the rocks, or there could be a
Right.
cave or something. And
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. It's like if the answer to Alien was actually one of them was a shape-shifting alien, right? Well, it's, Battlestar Galactica. One of you's a Cylon.
yeah,
It's yeah, and so the evil within us, and yeah, and each of them has the possibility to be that, right?
yeah,
Because they've all killed before, and that's the
yeah.
point, right?
Although,
Is
yeah, although none of them are. I would say none of them are as sadistic as the judge.
no, I know.
Judge is the judge is very sadistic. I hope you don't mind me saying that, but, like,
Yeah, yeah,
he's that's what bothered me so much. It's like the vampire Dracula's sadistic, but you never get in no part of the book is written really from his perspective. Whereas
right,
you get the judge's perspective at the end, and you're like, "Wow, this guy's like I'm not sure if he isn't worse than all the other characters." Like, even though he only kills off guilty people, and they killed innocent people, but still he's, like, so ruthlessly going after them that it's just
right.
kind of
Who is he to deal out judgment like that?
yeah,
So
I don't at the end, I mean, I didn't necessarily connect with any of the characters because I don't think you're supposed to really. I don't think she wrote it
right.
so
And I
that
think that's part of the whole why it's so bare bones,
yeah, very
right?
bare
It's
bones.
really just yeah, you
Yeah,
don't really connect with it. Well, I feel like they do. She tries to get you to connect with Vera. I think she's the one that you most connect with because she's the longest there,
yeah,
and so and she has done something truly horrible. Um, but it's interesting. So let's talk through the book,
yeah.
okay?
So it
So we open with um, they're all going to an island, and it's been owned by a millionaire, and crazy things have been happening on this island, which immediately reminded me of Glass Onion, which I know you haven't seen yet. But if you've seen the Knives Out movies, the first thing that I thought seeing Glass Onion was, oh, they're all gonna die. So
yeah.
and without giving away the ending, no, they don't. It's not, and then there were none. It's a different mystery, but they're very similar. And yeah, but but we've seen that before, right?
Yes.
Crazy eccentric millionaire gathering people out there. And I think that's one of the ways that she set it up so it worked with the island. I remember thinking, why does nobody respond to their SOS, right? Why does nobody respond to anything? And it's because all the villagers have been told, well, it's an eccentric millionaire and they're throwing a party and don't pay
Yeah,
any attention, right?
yeah,
Um, and I love that. But what intrigues me most is they get there, they see the poem, they hear the record, right? The voice of doom, which charges them each with who they've killed, with their
yeah.
murder story, right? And later we learn why the murderer chose these people, and they are all people who got away with it. They
Yes.
are all people who can't be judged by the judgment system, by the justice system that we have in place, um, for different reasons.
Yeah.
Um, and he has organized them in his mind according to who's going to die, according to their level of guilt. Or so, yeah. So not necessarily how guilty are they, but how do they themselves perceive their guilt,
Yeah.
right? So the first one to
Well,
die is
is
Marcy.
it is it how they perceive their guilt though, or is it truly the judges? Because
because he's manipulating them, right? That's the whole point, is that he has figured out that Vera is going to be the one who takes it so much to heart she will kill herself by the end,
Oh,
right?
okay. Okay.
But
Yeah.
the others, he has to kill them off in order and be very specific with who dies when. And so
Hmm.
he says he starts with Marston because he feels no guilt at all,
Oh, yeah, that's right. He does.
because he ran over some kids and didn't even look back, and he never got caught, right? And he's still speeding around the countryside. So there's your first hit and run person. And then you have the wife of the husband, who they just didn't give the medicine to the old lady so that she would die so that they would inherit, right?
Yep.
So they can't charge them with anything, which is interesting because she's another book that kind of is about that later, as does Dorothy L. Sayers. So it's an interesting thought of, is negligence or lack of action
Yeah.
just as guilty as someone actually taking a knife to somebody,
Yeah.
right? Um, and I think it's interesting how he chose them, how Agatha really chose them, right, and put them in order by their backstory, and so who's really guilty, and um, by according to the judge, they're all guilty, right?
Yeah.
He sees them all as guilty,
Yeah.
even though, but then like Philip Lombard, right up front, he says that he doesn't feel any guilt, and yet he survives all the way to the end too.
Yeah.
Why isn't he one of the ones that immediately gets hit off? And I think it's because he had a gun, and so the judge knew that he needed to stay longer. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, so going through each of the characters, though, Corin, you at one point you messaged me and you were like, okay, so each one represents
Yeah.
something different.
Yeah.
And you had a thought about when a certain person dies. It's interesting because then what happens after that? So did you want to kind of go through like how they each represent something?
Sure. Yeah. I did note that so you have, obviously the judge represents justice, the law. The character of Bloor, who is a kind of a ex-policeman turned private investigator, is law enforcement or detection. Vera, who's a governess, represents education. You have Dr. Armstrong practicing medicine. You have Emily Brent, the religious woman representing, the kind of the church and the religious take on things. The Rogers couple, who are there to serve the guests, represent people in service. The Playboy Anthony Marston kind of represents the leisure class who are used to being served.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel MacArthur obviously is the military, and then Philip Lombard would be kind of the explorer adventurer type. And so you have like these different people come from very different parts of society, and they kind of represent in some ways, like in some way, the corruption of society, of this whole, coming from different building blocks of, how a country is run, really.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of representing the corruption of that. And one of the things I did notice is that Emily Brent, the religious lady, is not necessarily a very sympathetic character.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she's kind of a battle axe of a character.
Yes.
However, I did notice that the characters really decline in their kind of their sanity and their suspicion, their paranoia of each other after her death. And I'm not sure if Agatha Christie was trying to make any kind of statement with this. But I did wonder sometimes if they're the how the character, like what they represented in the world and them dying off, was a part of sort of the disintegration of like this little civilization on the island. And so you have
Yeah.
the death of religion, basically,
Right.
of any sense of a higher power bringing justice.
Mm.
And then you have people who are basically just out to survive
Mm-hmm.
and will do anything to survive.
Right. They become animals at that point. They're just animalistic, fight or flight, right? And they're all turning into fight at this point.
Yeah, which Emily Brent actually is the last character who intentionally goes around by herself because she's not afraid of death. I'm not sure if she's truly not afraid of death, but she
Mm-hmm.
does not run around hiding.
Mm-hmm.
She's almost too confident. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's interesting. After that, they become very paranoid. They become
Yeah.
rats kind of trapped in the house fighting each other.
Right. Right. And
Yeah.
even more suspicious because at that point they know basically they're alone, right? It
Yeah.
has to be one of them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's where then the switch happens, right? Where you think you
Yeah.
start thinking, okay, I think I know who it must be.
Yeah.
Like I guessed the judge pretty early on. The very first time I read it, I was like, oh, it's the judge because he's dealing out justice. It seemed obvious to me. But then he died.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, nope, not the judge. So it must be somebody else.
That's different.
Like going through. And that's why it's so brilliant. Is that part right there is as soon as you start thinking it's either the judge or the doctor, and then they die. And you're like,
yeah.
there's no way. And I remember getting to the end and going, it's Vera? There's no way it's Vera. And then she hung herself. And I was like, no, no, there's no way. Because she just didn't seem like the type.
Yeah.
I guessed Philip. I thought, okay, it's got to be Philip. He's the only one who's heartless enough to do this, but he's not conniving enough.
Yeah.
So there's no way he could have done it. Yeah.
I did not suspect the judge.
Really? Yeah.
I don't remember who I suspected, but I remember being very surprised that it was the judge.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a little bit disappointed because I don't know. He came across as kind of a wise old guy for a while. Like he was kind of the wise man, and I thought he kind of had things under control, and then he dies, but I was like, oh, that's too bad. He's kind of a martyr to his cause, you know. Then at the end, he's a sadistic killer. So I'm like, well.
Exactly.
He put up a good front.
Exactly. He really does. He really does.
Yeah.
And that's part of the with the adaptations. I feel like his character doesn't change in the adaptations. It's still.
Oh, I think they make him friendlier in the 40s one.
Yes. Yes.
They make him Irish and friendly, I think.
Yeah. Those Irishmen, you can always trust them. But yeah. And well, I'm trying to remember who played him in the 40s one, or even in the new. Who plays him in the new one?
The judge. Charles Dance, he was perfect for him.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Very like ice blue eyes and
right.
Very stern demeanor. Like he absolutely fits with how I see the judge. The 1940s actor was so different that I thought he was a different character at first.
Yes.
I thought he was Bloor.
Exactly. Bloor. Yeah. Bloor's another one that I never connect with in the book.
Yeah.
He doesn't have enough of a personality. He's just there. He's just very, he's very Bloorish. He's just very brash and you know, I don't know. He's probably one of the characters that I dislike the most, but.
Interestingly enough, he actually, I think, edges towards remorse in the story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he does finally start wondering about he's implicated in the death of someone by perjury. He didn't actually kill someone.
Right.
He perjured himself, and that led to someone's death. So, and then he actually starts thinking, I wonder how that guy's family is doing. I kind of wondered sometimes if the characters weren't kind of awakening to conscience during the book. And I don't know I'm not sure if I would, I don't know how confident I can be in that. But yeah, I was kind of surprised by Bloor. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that Vera ever, honestly, as sympathetic as she can come across at times, I don't know how much she ever really regretted, but she did. So
I think she regrets the outcome of her decisions.
Yeah.
Right? That she doesn't get the guy and she did it anyway.
Yeah.
And so that's what she regrets. I don't know that she regrets killing the kid.
Even with Emily Brent is such a stern character, but right before she goes, she's having visions of her maid at the window trying to get in.
Okay, that part. When I read that, I was like, I do not remember DID being part of this. But that's totally how I read it. Was she's writing a note to herself, and suddenly the persona of the maid is writing for her, is saying it was Amelia. And it's this weird thing. And
I didn't understand that at all, because I noticed that, and she's like, and the maid is accusing herself of murder, I think.
Right, and it's this whole twisted thing. Yeah.
So I didn't know what was going on with Emily at the end, if she was kind of going off a rocker, but it felt to me like, I'm like, is she starting to really get affected by what she did? The reason why I struggle with Emily being convicted of murder by the judge is that, she had a maid who got pregnant, and you know, in those days, that wasn't really acceptable, and so
Mhm.
she fired her maid. Um, the maid ended up committing suicide, and the judge thinks that Emily Brent is responsible for this.
Right.
Now, firing someone, that person killing themselves, and then the person who did the firing being liable for murder, I don't really buy. I don't
Yeah.
think that Emily was not a kind woman. She's not
Mhm.
compassionate,
Mhm.
but is she to be held responsible for someone else's decision in that way?
Right.
As if she did it. Like, can think of a lot of people who might get fired, and there might be legitimate reasons for them to be fired, and they'd be in so much despair they would take their life. I wouldn't necessarily say that's now their former boss is culpable for murder.
Right.
So that's where the judge's mentality starts to break down a little bit for me. It's kind of like Emily Brent is supposed to just be such an unpleasant religious woman that we're supposed to just be like, oh yeah, she needs to go.
Right.
But I don't feel that about her,
Mhm.
actually. Like, I didn't necessarily like Emily Brent, but she had, I mean, she was very much what you see is what you get.
Mhm.
She was completely the opposite of Vera, in my opinion.
Yes.
Emily Brent was not sympathetic, and yet at the end, I was kind of like, maybe she actually has more genuine capacity for remorse, whereas Vera, I don't think does. So it was the women kind of felt like polar opposites of each other.
Mhm.
One very unsympathetic and yet kind of cracking at the end. And I guess Vera cracks. I mean, she hangs herself, but it's I don't like you said. It's like, is it just despair because what she ended up not getting what she wanted? You know,
Mhm.
so the whole kind of awakening to conscience in the story, and which characters truly awaken to conscience, and are they the characters that you don't empathize with as much as you're reading them? But then by the end, there's a crack there in their armor
Mhm.
versus the characters who are maybe more sympathetic or a little bit more, you know, and then you're kind of like, oh, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I don't know that I sympathize with any of them. Like, there's not one of them that I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that was acceptable behavior, right? That was okay."
no, they're all pretty unpleasant in a
No,
lot of ways.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But like you said, but they're not cold-blooded.
Not cold-blooded, calculated first-degree murderers, you know,
Right,
like
right, which is why they haven't been brought before the bench, right?
yeah,
They haven't been caught. Is
yeah,
because they just made decisions that cost someone else their life, right? So, like,
yeah,
the whole Colonel, comparing himself to David and Bathsheba and, putting is it Uriah is the husband, putting him before uh, sending him out to war so that he'll die so that David can marry Bathsheba. And that whole comparison to the Colonel and his choice and what he did, which was the same thing. Um, those kinds of decisions where it's see now in that case, right? David is held responsible for what he did, right?
yes,
Um, so the colonel should be held responsible for what he did, even though he's constantly saying, oh well, it's war and mistakes happen, right? And we lost a lot of good men that day. And I think it's perfect and poignant that she then has the police say exactly that when they're looking at the case.
mhm,
They say, "Oh, well, I don't know what that was about. Yeah, he lost him, but we lost a lot of good men that day." He says exactly what the argument was in the colonel's head.
wait,
Um, his
at the very end when the police are talking the case over?
Yes, exactly. They
Oh,
go through each of the people as they were listed on the record
yeah,
because they had to hunt them down. Okay, so well, what was this talking about? Oh yeah, this person did this person did that. When they come to the colonel, that's what they say. So they do write it off, right? Just like
mhm,
when they get to Vera, they say, well, she's not at fault, right? The mother said, nope, she did her best. She went
yeah,
after him, she almost got swept away herself and all of that. And but we still know that she's guilty of what she did.
yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
which again with the twists and the adaptations and stuff, we've got several people in the chat are talking about different adaptations of Agatha Christie uh, dramas, including Poirot and Miss Marple, and then the one we were talking about before we started, John Malkovich in ABC Murders. So, Sarah, I also did not like John Malkovich in ABC Murders, but that's because I feel very strongly that the original Agatha Christie books are all cozy mysteries. And so, a cozy mystery reader like myself is not looking for the dark element that was added in the Malkovich versions. His portrayal of Poirot was very not in keeping with my picture of Poirot. David Suchet to me is quintessential Poirot. He is exactly the Poirot that I picture in my head. He says everything. But I did not, I didn't either. Exactly. Yeah. I did not care for Malkovich's version. And it's not just him. It's not his fault that he's always cast as a bad guy. But it's more the choice that they made and that they keep making in the remakes of Agatha Christie stuff lately is they're going a lot darker, like the Aidan Turner version of And Then There Were None. They made some really dark choices. What did you say? The Bloor, right? Who commits perjury in the book.
Yeah.
In the movie, he actually hits somebody or beats them up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just much more graphic and much more in your face. And I think the beauty of Agatha Christie is her ambiguity.
Yeah.
Is her asking that.
Yeah.
Those questions. So, yeah.
They lost some of the ambiguity in the more recent adaptation of And Then There Were None. Just the ambiguity of were the characters truly guilty or not. In a more calculated way. Because you have people like Colonel Armstrong in the book, he sends the lover to the front in the war to die.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think in the film, in the TV series, he shoots him in the back of the head. And part of me was wondering how on earth did he get away with that?
Right.
So it's, he could have gotten away with it, but that would have been a different getting away with it than just sending someone to do a mission where you think there's a high chance they're going to die in a war. So it was more like they actually escaped the justice system as opposed to the justice system truly doesn't really have anything on them.
Right.
Yeah.
Which does link into what Sarah just said about the new Murder on the Orient Express, which you have seen Murder on the Orient Express, Corin?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay. So without giving away the ending of that one, because that's another one that is amazing. However, I think it's worth noting that it's another one where it's all about the ambiguity of the murderer, about who is guilty and whether the justice system has failed in catching this person. And so therefore justice must be taken into our own hands.
Yeah.
And then ultimately Poirot's decision about how he handles it at the very end. Yeah. Right?
Yep.
He chooses something that you would not expect at the very end. And it is worth noting for his character and how Agatha Christie seems to have chosen to approach crime. It's also interesting that Poirot makes decisions that are very different from Miss Marple.
Yes.
So it's hard to know exactly where Agatha Christie fell, what her beliefs were regarding justice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the Enneagram enthusiasts think that she was a 1 on the Enneagram, that she was about that right and wrong and that she loved the killer to come to justice. And I remember seeing an interview, I think it was her grandson was saying that about her. He was like, if my grandmother did not bring the killer to justice, she had very good reason in her novels.
Right.
Because she really believed strongly in that right and wrong and the guilty should be brought to justice. But then she had she actually seemed to be intrigued by stories where that very thing is questioned.
Right.
She also loves to play with that and invert it.
Exactly. So, Corin, I'm a 1 too. So, and I love to play with that too, right? Yeah, I've got 2 murderers who have gotten away with it so far.
Yeah.
In my books. And because I do believe I very much see the world black and white. And yet some of my favorite movies are where they twist that. Right? Yeah. Retelling Wicked Witch of the West as someone who you sympathize. I love that. I love those kinds of stories where it twists that on its head.
Yeah.
Because it does make you really stop and remind yourself that we are not in charge of justice, right? Yeah. That in the end, there is a higher justice.
Yes.
Right? At least you and I believe that, right?
Yes.
As Christians, we believe in a higher justice. So, which means that I don't have to worry about who's going to get it, even though it's good to see the murderer get caught. So,
Yeah. Well, one of the things I did make note of is that there is no, I mean, specifically from a Christian standpoint, there is no grace or compassion in the
Mhm.
world of the island in and
Mhm.
then
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
there's no hope. I mean,
Yeah.
so that was kind of what I was thinking the whole time, is the judge is certainly someone who's taking matters into his own hands. And I think someone, I don't remember exactly which character it was. It may have been Lombard or Bloor said that, oh, the judge is the God Almighty. Like he's usurping
Yes.
that kind of divine role, and he's now meting out justice according to his own. And I'm like, yeah, that's why the book can feel so grim by the end. It's just
Right.
there isn't a lot of there just isn't a lot of hope, which is interesting because I know that Agatha Christie was a Christian.
Right.
And she actually does, like, through Miss Marple, she has
Yes.
Miss Marple's Poirot also is a Catholic, so
Yes.
they both kind of have, they don't often say those things overtly, talk about Christianity overtly, but they do kind of have their moments. And I was reading Nemesis today, and we were going to talk about that a little bit. And you know, Miss Marple has been commissioned to find to investigate a cold case by
Mhm.
a friend who has passed away.
Mhm.
And her thought process is, well, I believe in eternal life. This friend who's passed away is somewhere out there. So I need to do his request, like I need to,
Right.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
and interestingly, because we talked about kind of going into Nemesis a little bit, because that's a
Yeah.
different take on justice.
Yeah.
But then also, I was thinking when we were reading And Then There Were None about Murder on the Orient Express, and I think it would be so interesting to do like a triple bill and compare different.
Ooh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
just where justice especially is examined. I mean, there is
Mhm.
that Murder on the Orient Express kind of, and the newer film version, Kenneth Branagh version, really emphasized that
Yes.
ambiguity and in a really beautiful way.
Mhm.
And then Nemesis, I love because it's like a totally different take on justice, where Miss Marple is being ruthless. So
Mhm.
the judge in And Then There Were None has a kind of ruthlessness.
Mhm.
There's a question of whether this ruthlessness is actually being employed for justice. Then there's Miss Marple, who is going back sort of into the past to investigate this cold case
Mhm.
at the request of a friend who has died. And he commissions her because he knows that she's like a bulldog and she's not going to give up until she finds the guilty person.
Mhm.
But Miss Marple would not invite a bunch of guilty people to an island and kill them off. Like
Right.
that's not her style. So yeah,
And yeah, and it is similar though. See, I mean, but the argument could be made that like all murder mysteries examine that question of
of what
justice,
justice. Yeah,
right? Of what is justice?
yeah,
Um, and when is it okay for us to take justice into our own hands? I mean,
mhm,
because there ultimately almost all murder mysteries, right, are asking the question of, well, what should we do with the murderer now? Right?
yeah,
Once you catch the murderer, once you
yeah,
know who did this terrible, horrible thing,
yeah,
now what?
yeah.
Right? Are you gonna throw him in jail? Or are you gonna put him before a judge? Or are you gonna just go hang him because you've decided, right, that this is an eye for an eye? Um, and Nemesis was really beautiful. I'd forgotten that one,
Yeah,
um, because that one also asks the question, "What is love?" Which I
yeah,
think is tied into justice.
yeah,
Um, and I
yep.
do think it's really interesting that you pointed out that and then there were none. There's no compassion.
There's
There
no
is no they never care about each other. It's always, "Well, I think I can trust you enough that you're not gonna kill me, that you're not the killer," right? But they never show compassion, and if they had, like, if that record had gone off and then they had all admitted their guilt and then said, but I think that there's a higher justice," or, or
there is grace and forgiveness.
there yeah, exactly, like,
There is
what a
redemption.
different story that would be.
Yeah, yeah. If they believed in some kind of redemption, whether it was specifically Christian or just that
Right.
they
But
could
even karma,
yeah,
even, believing in yin and yang and that there's a good
yeah,
balancing out evil, right? Which
yeah,
almost everybody believes that there is good balancing out evil, right? That there is a
yeah,
balance in the universe.
yeah. Well, and also just that by confessing something, you're not just allowing justice to take its course, but you're also bringing healing to yourself.
Right.
They don't have the capacity to acknowledge that what they did was wrong. They might do that in the secrets of the secret place in their hearts where they're experiencing it as torment, but they're not able really until the very end to just sort of admit, except for Philip Lombard, but he's so disconnected from the kind of the tragedy of what he did. But
Right.
it's like, what would it have been if they had been able to say, yes, we did this and we've been suffering for it,
Hmm.
especially characters like the Rogers, where Mrs. Rogers has obviously been suffering from a
Right.
horribly guilty conscience. And
Yes.
I just feel sorry for her. I
Mhm.
just,
Mhm.
it's horrible to feel guilty about something and to think that you have nowhere to go with that because you have
Mhm.
to keep it hidden. And in a way, there's a self-destructiveness that kind of gets triggered on the island, especially when they're just so paranoid. It kind of almost feels like Lord of the Flies in some ways. It's just
I was just gonna say, when you were listing off each of the characters, oh my gosh, it's Lord of the Flies.
yes.
That's exactly what it is. Which I strongly dislike that book. I love And Then There Were None. So explain
Yeah.
that one to me. That means something.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
just the whodunit is so sad. I mean, Lord of the Flies is just so tragic in a lot of ways. It's just there's not the intrigue of the mystery as much of
Mhm.
who done it, you know.
Right.
Um,
You know who did it. Who's
yeah,
doing it.
but it is still an examination of the depravity of human nature, which
Right.
Agatha Christie is arguably examining here.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the judge seems to acknowledge that. I don't know, is he as depraved as the other characters because of what he's doing to them, or is he?
I think he thinks that he's above them, right? And the only reason he kills himself at the end is because he's going to die anyway.
Yes, yeah,
And to fulfill his grand plot, right?
yeah,
He had to be dead by the end and he's going to die anyway, and so he went down with one fell swoop, right? Originally when I was reading it, I kept thinking, "Oh, he kills himself at the end because he knows now he's guilty and he's a judge." And so he has found himself guilty of crimes of murder, of murdering all these people, right?
yeah.
So he must die because that's his judge mentality, right? But then when you read his letter at the end, that's not really why he kills himself. It's really just because it completes the poem.
Yeah,
Like, oh,
he doesn't have any remorse.
yeah,
He's not, and he admits that he's a sadist. He's like, "I'm sadistic, and I've always." He's like, he basically has always wanted to commit murder. He just needed a particular way to do it that he would feel was justified, and then he needed to have a time limit on his own life.
yeah.
So he just indulged um, that in him. He always was kind of a twisted up person, which
Hmm.
makes me think of just the biblical, and the Bible says that murder starts in the heart, that evil begins in the heart before you've even taken any action. This has always been in him. And now the certain circumstances are triggering this in him. And like, he's kind of showing his true colors in a way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, yeah. I mean, honestly, I did feel sorry for some of the characters that he killed.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily like them. I wasn't necessarily completely in sympathy with them, but I did feel sorry for all the people he picked off. I just thought, I wish these people had a second chance, like,
Yeah, well, exactly, exactly.
yeah,
What would they have done knowing that somebody knows what they did,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the ease with which the judge is able to find all of these things, right,
yeah,
means that there's definitely people out there who know what they've done.
yeah,
Um, so why hasn't someone who served with the colonel on the front lines, why hasn't he brought him out, right?
yeah.
As, hey, I know
Well,
what you did.
yeah, all this information has somehow come to the judge in some way or another.
Right. He goes around like just collecting it. And so it's just, why
Yeah,
didn't somebody else in their lives who knew what they had done call them out on it? And what would have happened then, right? If someone had approached the colonel, for example, because he's one who definitely feels the change of conscience is what you were saying, right? So the guilt, right? The guilt actually weighs on him enough that he goes off and he's like, "Yep, this is the end.
yeah, he just
I know I'm guilty," right? So if someone had told him, the person who tells the judge what he did, right? If someone had approached him about it, would he have tried to fix it?
Yeah.
Right? Would he have put himself up for court martial or, you
Yeah.
know, or,
Well, I don't remember him being particularly remorseful. If that's what you were thinking.
he's
I don't remember that. I remember him recalling his wife more affectionately.
yes,
But not necessarily regretting that he sent the lover off to die. So I don't
that's
know.
true.
I don't know.
That's actually a good point. None of them ever feel regret for what they did.
No. I mean, I think some of them might be getting there, but I think they get killed off too soon.
Yeah,
And it's only the pressure of being on the island that's even getting them there.
right. It's just the pressure of somebody knows what I did.
Someone knows what I did and they're coming after me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the lack of regret, and maybe
Yeah.
that's one of her points, is that they don't feel regret. None of them are
Yeah.
sorry for what they did. So can we forgive them when they don't feel sorry for what they did?
Yeah, she doesn't have any of them actually say I regret it.
No.
They all feel very justified.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And they spend the whole time whining about it, right? Well, no, I didn't it's not murder. It's not murder.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
well, I made a decision, but it's not murder. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say the exception is probably Mrs. Rogers, but you never get her perspective.
Right.
It's just sort of this
No.
faded.
She's just
Right.
there.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
she gets
There and then
she
she's not.
yeah, and then she's not. So, but no, I mean, again, maybe I want to see some remorse there, and so I see some of them as kind of approaching that place, like when Blore is saying, how did his family feel after I was kind of caused this guy's death, and when Emily is seeing her maid like knocking on the window and kind of as she's passing away. But I mean, it's not really concrete remorse
Mhm.
or anything. So, which also there is the question of, is this just kind of evil is this is the judge himself also just, are all these people kind of just, have they given into evil within themselves, and even the
Yeah.
judge? And so this is just kind of the end result of unchecked evil that's not talked about, that everybody's just holding within themselves. And then the judge just happens to get all these people together. He places them all together on this island. And
Mhm.
honestly, I think he's probably just as bad as all the rest of them.
Right, right,
And then it's just kind of this world destroying itself.
right. So, are they all Jekylls with a Hyde inside?
Yeah, I
You
think
know?
so. To connect it back to our last
Ultimately,
discussion.
yeah, ultimately, that's
Yeah.
what's happening.
Yeah. I
Mm,
remember from Jekyll and Hyde, when Hyde kills the old man, he feels gleeful.
right.
It's like almost like the judge, when the judge is like almost, well, is enjoying what he's doing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So it kind of sees how twisted it is, but not completely, because
Right.
he's himself and he only has his very, very warped perspective.
Because in the end, he's justifying it, just like they have all justified
Oh
their
yeah.
so actually, yeah, so he's just as guilty, right? He doesn't feel regret the same way none of them feel regret for their actions. To him, it's just
Oh
it's a game.
no, he does not feel guilty.
Yeah.
It's a question of like, he's a judge, but it's like he's also amoral in a
Yes.
way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Like,
that's true. That's an odd
yeah,
yeah.
he says he won't harm an innocent person, but he'll be ruthless to people who are not innocent, even
But
if they what? Go ahead.
but we're all guilty, right?
Well, we're definitely all guilty of doing wrong in our
We're
lives.
all sinful, right? So
Yeah,
who is he to decide, well, this action is so sinful it requires justice now,
that's
right?
kind of what I felt about him. Not to excuse what any of the characters have done,
Mhm.
but by the end, I was like, I think the judge is the worst of them all.
Yeah.
Honestly, because none of the other characters like would have killed off like 10 people. Like the judge is committing mass murder basically and thinking,
Yeah.
this is okay, like because of these circumstances and because I've always wanted to do it. And
Right.
This is my chance. And you're just
And because he's a judge, right? He sets up the whole thing as a
yeah,
court case, right? He indicts them first,
yeah,
and reads off what they're sentenced with, and how do you plead, right?
yeah.
And then they all, oh, I'm not guilty. I'm not guilty, right? I didn't do it. Oh, well, I am guilty, and I don't care, right? That kind of thing. And it's
But they don't get due process. I mean,
right.
he is definitely judge, jury, and executioner. I mean, that's
Yeah.
literally what
Yeah.
he is. And so part of what I was thinking was like, look, I mean, for justice to operate properly, like you can't convict people without sufficient evidence.
Right.
Like none of these people have sufficient evidence maybe to convict them, or the people who could offer that evidence aren't coming forward.
Hmm.
And it's maybe this isn't the right perspective of mine, but part of me just thinks, yeah, they shouldn't be convicted unless there's enough evidence. You can't convict people without sufficient evidence.
Hmm.
So my thoughts were kind of like, yeah, I'm sure there are people who do wrong things and they don't get charged and they don't get convicted or punished for them. But that's kind of how the justice system works. And you have to have like what we're going to be talking about in our next discussion about the Leavenworth case, about
Hmm.
evidence,
Hmm.
circumstantial evidence, and how
Exactly. Hmm.
the system of law and justice has to be so careful, and
Hmm.
can't just say, well, you seem guilty, or
Right. Yeah.
I heard this, someone spilled the beans in the bar, so now you got to go. It's
Yeah.
got to be a structure that has integrity. And so part of my perspective was, yeah, these people got off on their crimes, and that does happen. And I don't think that they should necessarily be picked off now by this crazy judge. So
Hmm.
by the end, the judge was the one that I was least sympathetic with.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the other characters, I didn't necessarily, I don't excuse what they did, but I did feel sorry for them because I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's, but again, maybe it's just because I want to be able to sympathize with someone. I want to like someone.
Hmm.
And I was looking for ways to connect to the characters because that's what I do when I read. And again, I would say none of them probably were truly remorseful, but the ones that like I had more emotion behind their crime, or like, I don't know. I ended up feeling a little bit more sorry for them, but I probably shouldn't.
Mhm. Maybe that's why in the ones where Agatha Christie does write it with the murderer getting off, right?
Mm,
Usually the only reason it works in the book is because you do sympathize with them.
yeah,
You sympathize with the murderer. You're like, no, that person deserved it. I'm
yeah,
glad they're dead.
yeah,
um, because somewhere in us is that sense of justice, right? We were
yeah,
created for a perfect world where there would be justice. And so
yeah,
and God is a
yeah,
just God.
yeah,
And so we have that element in our we're just naturally made that way, right? We're
yeah,
we're seeking that perfection of equality,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Even though it will never happen in this world,
yeah.
right?
Well, this will feed really nicely into our next discussion, the Leavenworth case, because we're
Yes.
going to be talking about those. I assume we're going to be talking about those quotes about even just how nature is sort of programmed in some ways to for the detection of crime. It's like
Right.
there's something in the world that wants the evildoers to be caught. It's like,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
so we're talking about those things in a much more positive and happy case.
Yes. Yes.
A much happier murder.
Right. Right. A happy murder. Yes. A little romance thrown in. So,
More characters you could actually like and connect to, I think.
exactly. Exactly.
Mm.
Um, yeah. This has been a really good discussion, Corin. Thank
Yeah, it's been
you.
fun.
We have hit an hour, so I think we'll probably go ahead and start wrapping up. Was there anything else that you wanted to?
No, I think we covered everything, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So next, yeah, because that segues nicely into next month we'll be reading the Leavenworth Case, which, yep, my copy's right there. There we go. The Leavenworth Case by Katharine Green. And this one is very near and dear to my heart because next month, May 30th, my book about Katharine Green writing her first draft of this, which was in 1872. And then she publishes it 6 years later. So my book, A Deed of Dreadful Note, is coming out May 30th. And it is about Katharine Green writing this. And it is it is an homage to the Leavenworth Case. It's very similar, but very, very different. And we can talk a lot about that, about what the difference is between homage and pastiche and weaving in and retellings and all of that. I definitely want to get into that. So we'll get into that next month, because then we can really talk about what we're working on right now. But yeah, so if you want to join us for the Leavenworth Case, you can find it on audiobook some places. My husband, Andrew D. Meredith, is currently recording it. So that will be coming out at the same time as our book, but we'll be reading this before my book comes out. So, but it'll just build up anticipation for it. So if you can fit it into your TBR, into your reading list, I highly recommend it. It's a very, very good book. It's a Victorian book. It's a Victorian novel. So if you're not used to reading a Victorian novel, I give you permission to skim. It's okay. If you can, really let the language wash over you. It is beautifully written. It is so beautiful. And I think you'll find it's actually very fast paced for a Victorian novel. I think it's very dialogue heavy. There's a lot of action. It's kicks off with an inquest, which is the first book of its kind to do that, and it's really well crafted, and it is the basis for everything you know today as mystery. This was an overnight bestseller in 1878, so which was 9 years before Sherlock Holmes. So, and we can get into all of that next month, or you can check out my videos. I've been doing a whole bunch of videos about Anna Katharine Green and her inspiration, where she got it from, and then what she inspired later on with Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and then I'll be talking about some other ones too later in other videos. But yeah, so if you get a chance to pick up the Leavenworth Case, I highly recommend it. It's a very, very good read. So yeah, that's it for next month. And then do we know what we're doing the month after that?
Wizard of Oz and short.
Yes. Yeah. Wizard of Oz, and it's a middle grade fiction, right? I guess you would call it short. So it's a very quick read. Also, Wizard of Oz is a very quick read, and is wonderful. So we'll be doing that and talking about how the two work together. And Wizard of Oz is another one that's very near and dear to my heart. So I have a lot of things to talk about with that one. So if you're making your TBR, add those to your reading list, and hopefully we'll see you next time for our live discussion. And you can join in the chat on the side. Say hi. Be sure to say hi, and hit that subscribe button for my channel. And then Corin is we're going to get Corin a channel here eventually. But for now, you can follow him here and find out what he's doing everywhere. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. So thanks. Bye.
Bye.